In the 9th century, somewhere in the mountains of Sichuan or Shanxi province in China, a group of Taoist alchemists were trying to do something that had absolutely nothing to do with warfare. They were trying to live forever. Convinced that the right combination of minerals could produce an elixir of immortality, they spent years mixing, heating, and experimenting with whatever substances they could get their hands on, following recipes passed down through generations of mystical and medicinal tradition. At some point, one particular batch combined three ingredients: saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Instead of granting eternal life, that mixture did something considerably more dramatic. It exploded. Early historical accounts mention singed beards and burned down workshops, which tells you everything you need to know about how that first encounter actually went. Nobody in that room was trying to invent a weapon. They called the resulting substance Ho Yao, fire medicine, a name that still carries the faint, slightly embarrassing memory of its original purpose as a failed pharmaceutical rather than a future engine of conquest. And yet, that one accidental, beard-singeing batch of failed immortality medicine eventually became one of the most consequential chemical discoveries in the history of human conflict, the seed from which every gun, every cannon, and eventually every firearm on Earth would grow. So, how did humans get from a failed potion in a Taoist alchemy lab to a firearm? The answer runs through bamboo tubes strapped to spears, a siege that proved the new technology actually worked, several centuries of careful refinement, and the slow migration of knowledge across an entire continent that eventually reshaped the balance of power on nearly any inhabited landmass. Let's start with what that early gunpowder mixture actually was, because understanding the basic chemistry explains why everything that followed happened the way it did. The alchemists stumbled onto combined potassium nitrate, saltpeter, with charcoal and sulfur, roughly in a 75-15-10 ratio by weight. The saltpeter acted as an oxidizer, releasing oxygen rapidly when heated, and feeding an extremely fast combustion reaction that produced a sudden, violent expansion of gas. That expanding gas is the entire secret behind everything gunpowder would eventually be used for, whether launching fireworks into the night sky or launching a metal projectile out of a tube with enough force to punch through armor. In its earliest documented uses, gunpowder wasn't weaponized at all. It showed up in fireworks, smoke signals, and festival entertainment, exactly the kind of decorative, celebratory application you'd expect from something discovered by monks chasing immortality rather than military engineers chasing battlefield advantage. For generations, ordinary people across China encountered this substance primarily as spectacle, lighting up festivals and religious ceremonies with bursts of color and noise that had nothing to do with combat. That changed once military commanders during the Song dynasty saw what this volatile substance could actually do. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, Chinese engineers developed the Huoqiang, or fire lance. The design was about as simple a weapon could be. Take a length of bamboo, strap it to the end of a spear, and pack the tube with gunpowder, and light it during close combat. The result was a polearm that spewed flame and burning debris at anyone within arm's reach, turning an ordinary spear into something far more terrifying to face in a melee. Defenders reportedly used fire lances during the Siege of Dion in 1132 against attackers scaling their walls, and by all most accounts, the weapon worked as intended, scorching and disorienting attackers in a way conventional spears simply couldn't. The psychological effect alone mattered enormously. Soldiers trained their entire lives to fight with blades and spears, suddenly faced an enemy that could project fire itself. And that kind of shock often counted as much on a medieval battlefield as the physical damage inflicted. Once gunpowder proved itself in combat, innovation accelerated, with each improvement following a fairly logical next step. Fire lance makers began stuffing pellets and pottery shards into the bamboo tubes alongside the powder, transforming a weapon that produced flame into one that also flung projectiles outward with real force. This was a genuinely significant conceptual leap. It shifted the weapon's purpose from intimidation and burning towards penetrating injury delivered at a distance, the foundational idea behind every firearm that would follow. The next limitation was the bamboo itself, which couldn't handle the pressure of more powerful charges without splitting apart in the user's hands. Once Chinese craftsmen learned to cast bronze tubes strong enough to contain that pressure safely, the hand cannon was born, a weapon that used expanding combustion gas to launch a single solid projectile with much more force and range than any bamboo firelance. By the 13th century, metal-barreled hand cannons were in regular use across China, a genuine technological leap over the earlier bamboo weapons. Chinese engineers also scaled the same basic concept upward, producing devices with names like the thunderclap bomb and the heaven-shaking cannon, capable of delivering high-impact explosions and battering fortified positions that had once seemed unassailable. When the Mongols invaded China in the 1200s, they encountered these gunpowder weapons firsthand during sieges such as the defense of Kaifeng in 1232, and the experience left a lasting impression. Rather than simply being defeated by the new technology, the Mongols absorbed it. After conquering China and establishing the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weaponry with them as they pushed westward across Asia and towards the Islamic world. This is one of history's more underappreciated technology transfers. Mongol military campaigns functioned almost like an accidental delivery system, carrying gunpowder knowledge across enormous distances far faster than trade caravans or diplomatic exchange ever could, spreading a Chinese invention across the breadth of Eurasia within a few generations. It's also worth noting that gunpowder weapons didn't develop along a single straight line. Alongside hand cannons and fire lances, Chinese engineers developed rockets and fire arrows, which found use not just in China, but eventually in Korea and India, traveling along routes that overlapped but weren't identical to the hand cannon's path westward. These rocket weapons never disappeared the way the fire lance eventually did once true guns matured. Instead, they persisted as a distinct branch of gunpowder technology, one that would resurface centuries later in European warfare, and much later still in the earliest ancestors of modern military and space rocketry. The story of gunpowder doesn't just lead to the gun, it branches, with one path heading toward the firearm and an entirely separate path heading toward the rocket, both rooted in the same accidental discovery. From there, gunpowder spread outward along overlapping routes, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe through military contact, trade, and the broader wave of cross-cultural exchange that defined the 13th and 14th centuries. Historians point out that gunpowder wasn't the only major Chinese invention traveling west during this era. Paper, printing, and the magnetic compass moved along similar routes around the same time, part of a much larger east-to-west flow of knowledge long before anyone had coined the word globalization. Some historians have also noted that early European cannons resemble Chinese designs closely enough that direct transfer of knowledge seems more plausible than independent invention arriving at the same solution by coincidence. Once the technology reached Europe in the late 13th century, it landed in a political and military landscape that gunpowder would, over the following centuries, eventually transform, eventually helping to dismantle systems of feudal military power that had stood for hundreds of years. The change wasn't instant. Early European hand cannons, like their Chinese predecessors, were crude, slow to reload, and hard to aim, essentially a small cannon mounted awkwardly on a pole. A soldier loaded powder and shot into the open end, touched a smoldering ember or length of slow-burning cord to a small touch hole, and hoped the explosion sent the projectiles somewhere useful. Even in this primitive form, the weapon carried a psychological and practical impact that melee weapons couldn't match. Castle walls that had withstood traditional siege equipment for generations began falling to cannon fire. Mounted knights, the dominant military force in medieval Europe for centuries, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to a weapon indifferent to how much steel they wore. The entire social order built around expensive, heavily armored cavalry began to wobble, since a relatively cheap weapon in the hands of a far less expensively trained soldier could now neutralize an opponent who'd spent a lifetime and a fortune preparing for combat the traditional way. This shift reshaped the very architecture of European warfare. As cannons grew more powerful against vertical stone walls, traditional castle design, tall, thin walls meant to repel scaling attackers and arrows, became dangerously obsolete almost overnight in historical terms. Medieval engineers responded with the star fort and the bastion, lower, angled, thickly reinforced fortifications designed to deflect and absorb cannon fire rather than simply stand tall and hope for the best. The medieval castle, dominant across European landscape for centuries, was gradually replaced by structures that looked almost nothing like it, all because of a weapon that had originated half a world away in the hands of monks chasing immortality. The next major leap came in the late 15th century with the matchlock mechanism, the single development that finally turned gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into the backbone of organized infantry warfare. The problem with earlier hand cannons was that firing one required two hands and real coordination, one to steady the weapon, the other to apply a burning ember or cord to a small touch hole at exactly the right moment, all while trying to aim at a moving target in the chaos of battle. The matchlock solved this by attaching a slow-burning cord, held in a curved clamp called a serpentine, directly to the weapon. Pulling the trigger lowered the already burning cord into a small pan of priming powder, igniting the main charge automatically, and freeing the shooter to hold and aim with both hands right up to the moment of firing. It sounds like a modest mechanical tweak, but it was the first mechanical firing device ever applied to a small arm, and it let a single trained soldier fire a gunpowder weapon with real aimed precision for the first time. By the early 16th century, matchlock arquebuses were appearing across Western Europe, particularly in Spain, France, and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and the technology spread rapidly across Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire, already experienced with gunpowder since the 14th century, incorporated matchlocks into the elite Janissary Corps, using them to great effect in engagements such as the Battle of Diu in 1509. In 1543, Portuguese traders introduced matchlock technology to Japan, where local gunsmiths refined the design so thoroughly that Japanese matchlocks, known as tanegashima, came to be regarded as some of the finest firearms in the world, prized for their precision even by European observers. China itself, having started this entire chain of innovation centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention, developing matchlock bird guns to counter ongoing incursions along its northern frontier, a fittingly strange loop for a technology that began as a failed immortality potion in that same general region. Matchlock muskets eventually grew heavy enough to need a forked rest to just support the barrel while aiming, sometimes weighing 20 pounds or more, but capable of punching through plate armor at ranges that made swords and pikes increasingly irrelevant on an open battlefield. Because reloading took time and left the user vulnerable, musketeers typically needed protection from pikemen standing alongside them. This combination of pikes and shot dominated European battlefields from the 16th into the early 17th century, an elaborate tactical system requiring extensive coordination. The matchlock had one obvious persistent weakness. It required an open, slow-burning flame at all times, which made it nearly useless in wet weather, gave away a soldier's position in darkness, and demanded constant tending. The wheellock, developed in the early 15th century, used a spring-loaded wheel spinning against a piece of pyrite to generate sparks, eliminating the need for a constantly burning match. It made it far more practical for cavalry, who could now carry a loaded, ready weapon without tending an open flame on horseback, a mechanism especially associated with German mercenaries and English cavalry. But wheellocks were expensive and mechanically complex, which kept them from ever fully replacing the cheaper matchlock among ordinary infantry. The true breakthrough came with the flintlock, generally credited to the French gunsmith Marine Le Bourgeois, who developed the mechanism in its recognizable modern form around 1610-1615. The flintlock used a spring-loaded hammer holding a piece of flint that struck a steel surface called a frizzen to throw sparks directly into the priming pan. It was faster than a matchlock, dramatically more reliable in poor weather, and needed no open flame at all, meaning soldiers no longer gave away their position in the dark just by carrying a lit weapon. By the 1630s, the flintlock had spread rapidly across Europe, with the Dutch States Army among the first to adopt it as a standard-issue infantry weapon, and within a few decades, it had become the dominant firearm mechanism across essentially every major European military, a position it would hold for roughly 2 centuries, through colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by both colonial militias and British regulars defined the conflict from start to finish. The flintlock's arrival coincided with another important innovation, the socket bayonet, introduced in the late 17th century, which attached around the outside of the barrel via a metal ring, rather than plugging into the muzzle the way earlier plug bayonets had. A small change meant the soldier could fix a bayonet and still fire normally, combining ranged firepower and close combat capability in a single weapon for the first time. Armies no longer needed dedicated pikemen alongside musketeers, since every soldier with a flintlock and bayonet could function as both shooter and spearman. This infantry revolution simplified training and logistics and reshaped how European armies organized themselves on the battlefield. The flintlock's roughly 2-century reign ended in the early 19th century with the percussion cap system, a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive compound that ignited instantly when struck by a hammer, eliminating the need for loose priming powder, flint, and steel entirely. This final ignition innovation rendered every previous mechanism, matchlock, wheellock, and flintlock alike, essentially obsolete within a few decades, marking the last major milestone in the centuries-long chain of refinements that began with monks chasing immortality in 9th century China. From there, the pace of change only accelerated, leading toward repeating rifles, rapid advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, and eventually weapons that would have been unrecognizable to soldiers who once stood in disciplined lines with pikes and matchlocks waiting for their turn to fire. Looking back across this entire arc, from a Taoist alchemy lab in 9th century China to flintlock muskets dominating European battlefields nearly 8 centuries later, the story of how humans invented guns is really a story about accident, accumulation, and migration unfolding together over an enormous span of time. Nobody set out on day one to invent the firearm. A group of monks looking for immortality stumbled on an explosive chemical reaction and very nearly burned their own beards off in the process. Military engineers watching that reaction gradually realized its violence could be channeled, first through a tube strapped to a spear, then through a cast bronze cylinder, then through increasingly sophisticated mechanical systems designed to ignite that same basic chemical reaction more reliably, more quickly, and with less risk to the person holding the weapon.